Ready? If you would turn to John chapter 3, we've been going through this chapter 3 in John. Very popular. Parts of it are very popular, I should say. People seem to want to read one or two verses and forget about the rest of it. I think if you grew up in Sunday school as a kid, certainly you may have heard the story of Nicodemus in this passage. But oftentimes, and I'm not saying this about every Sunday school teacher, but oftentimes the story of Nicodemus is not tied in with verse 16. Verse 16 being the most popular verse in this chapter amongst, not just amongst Christians, but again amongst everybody. I mean, even the lowest of the unsaved seem to know John 3:16. We see it, you know, if you ever watch sports, professional sports especially, even college sports, on TV, well, I guess even in person, you see it on banners on the wall, or somebody in the crowd holding up a banner. They never, though, very seldom you ever see anybody actually have the whole verse. It's always just John 3:16. Okay, well, to the world, that's nothing. You know, well, okay, so what? What's John 3:16? And most people, because they recognize it as a Bible verse, immediately they're turned off and not even going to go look it up. Sometimes you see it on bumper stickers on people's vehicles, and in that case, oftentimes you do see the whole verse written out, or a abbreviated version of the verse. An abbreviated version of it doesn't do it justice, of course. And as we looked at verses 1 through 21 in the last two sermons on this, the last two lessons, when read in context, John 3:16 does not always mean what the world thinks it means, or what the religious world thinks it means, and is not applied the way that they try to apply it. Nowhere does it say God loved everybody in the world. And if you continue on and read the rest of the passage, you see that Jesus tells that God didn't love everybody. But people look at that and they say, well, it says God so loved the world. Well, yeah, God does love his creation. He does love people in all parts of the world, but not the whole world, not everybody. He has those. There are those who are not saved, that never will be saved. They're not his elect. That he tells us that, you know, he hates iniquity and hates the doers of iniquity. What does that tell us? There's people that God hates. Now, this tonight should be our last lesson in this chapter. We're going to go ahead and read the rest of the chapter. It kind of ties together. In the rest of the chapter, we don't see Jesus speaking, but we do see what he's doing after he leaves Nicodemus. If you read in context verses 1 through 21, you see that whole passage there is Jesus and Nicodemus talking with each other, and it's mostly Jesus explaining to him the gospel, the new birth. Nicodemus, being a Jew, being a Pharisee, a leader of the Jews, he didn't understand the new birth that Jesus talked about, and Jesus even questioned him. How come you don't know this? You're a ruler of the Jews. This is something you should know. It was taught in the law. It was taught by the Old Testament prophets. The things that people try to use John 3:16 for, the Bible is clear on what this verse means. If you take it the way some people use it, the Bible would contradict itself, and it doesn't. There's parts of this chapter that would contradict with verse 16, but they don't if you read it in context. Again, taking a verse out of context, you got to be careful about that, because you wind up there's whole denominations, whole religious sects that have based all their beliefs and all their doctrine on one verse taken out of context. And Baptists are not innocent of it either. There's Baptists that have and still do the same thing. There are Baptists who used to believe what we believe on this, that now have changed. In verse 22 is where we're going to start tonight, and like I said, we're going to try to finish the chapter. We see John the Baptist here. In our study on Sunday evening, we were in Matthew, and we saw where Matthew recorded or retold the death of John the Baptist. He was already dead at that point. Tonight, John's not dead yet. In verse 3 or in chapter 3, he's still out baptizing and preaching, and we see that. And so let's start with John chapter 3, verse 22. After these things came Jesus and his disciples into the land of Judea, and there he tarried with them and baptized. And John also was baptizing in Aenon, near to Salim, because there was much water there, and they came and were baptized. And for John was not yet cast into prison. So John's still a free man. Herod has not taken him prisoner yet. Now, it mentions here in verse 22, it says, after these things. So after the conversation with Nicodemus, came Jesus and his disciples into the land of Judea. So they're moving right along with their ministry. They're moving into another area, into Judea. And there he tarried with them and baptized. Now, some tell us Jesus didn't baptize anybody. That's what we've been told, right? Well, I believe that. I'm not doubting that. Well, we're going to go look at a place here in a moment that tells that. But what is this here? He says, there he tarried with them. With who? With his disciples. And baptized. Now some say, well, that means Jesus baptized. No. It could mean two or three things. It could mean Jesus baptized. It could mean Jesus and his disciples baptized. Or it could mean that just his disciples baptized. So, again, people will stop here and base a whole doctrine on this. But if you turn to the very next chapter, chapter 4, in verses 1 and 2, it's real simple. When therefore the Lord knew how the Pharisees had heard that Jesus that Jesus made and baptized more disciples than John. This was a rumor going around. In other words, the Pharisees had heard that Jesus had baptized more people than John the Baptist did. Verse 2 says, though Jesus himself baptized not, but his disciples. So why is Jesus getting accused of this? Well, his disciples, the apostles, the 12 disciples, 12 apostles, were the ones doing the baptizing. How? Well, they did it under Jesus' authority. He gave them the authority to baptize. So, in a roundabout way, yes, he was in charge of the baptizing, but he was not the one physically doing it. He was the one that gave the authority. And did you catch what I said there? The 12. At this point in time, the 12 are together with Jesus. Remember who's part of the 12? Judas Iscariot. You think Judas got left out of the baptizing? Nothing ever tells us that, does it? It appears as though all 12 of them were performing baptisms. That tells us that the authority is not in the man, or in the man that's doing the baptizing, but in their day it was in the Lord. In our day it would be in the church. The authority comes from the church. Now, preferably you wouldn't want a man who's not saved to baptize people. That's not how we would do it. We would look for somebody who, if we didn't have a pastor, we would look for somebody else who was of like faith for sure, and we knew for sure was saved and was a member of one of the Lord's churches to help with the baptism. But in this case, at this point in time, the Lord is the only one that knew that Judas was not a saved man, that he was a devil. Now, John was baptizing also at the same time. Verse 25, then there arose a question between some of John's disciples and the Jews about purifying. And they came unto John and said unto him, Rabbi, he that was with thee beyond Jordan, to whom thou bearest witness, behold, the same baptizeth, and all men come to him. Now, remember what John had said when Jesus first showed up on the scene to start his ministry. He said, I must decrease so he can increase, basically. That's not a direct quote, but that's what he was saying. He was going to slowly fade away while Jesus came on the scene and became the highlight of the show, in other words. He was going to be the one that the whole focus was going to be on. It says, all men come to him. So people had stopped coming to John for baptism, and were now going to Jesus. Again, Jesus wasn't baptizing anybody. His disciples were doing it, but he was giving the authority to them to do it. But these disciples of John and the Jews, in other words, these were people who were saved and people who were not saved. His disciples and the Jews, it says. If they were all saved, he could have said just his disciples, or he could have just said the Jews. But obviously there's a distinction between the two. You've got John's disciples and the Jews. And then John says in verse 27, John answered and said, a man can receive nothing except it be given him from heaven. So what is he talking about here? Again, another verse that's taken out of context often. Back up to the verse before that, verse 26. All men come to him. That's what he's talking about. This is a continuation of that. This is all in the same paragraph, just a continuation. A man can receive nothing except to be given him from heaven. What is he talking about? The men that they were saying were going to Jesus for baptism were given to him by heaven. Jesus told us that, didn't he? Several times in his ministry it's recorded that that the ones that the Father sent him, he was going to take them. He was going to keep them. That's who he was there for. In verse 28, ye yourselves bear me witness that I said I am not the Christ, but that I am sent before him. Now, when he says the Christ here, he means the Messiah. I'm not. He says, I've told you several times, I'm not the Christ, but this man is. And they still didn't understand, did they? He says, but I am sent before him. He was the forerunner that was talked about in the Old Testament. He that hath the bride is the bridegroom, but the friend of the bridegroom, which standeth and heareth him, rejoiceth greatly because of the bridegroom's voice. This my joy therefore is fulfilled. Who is the friend of the bridegroom? John the Baptist. Some refer to him as the best man at the wedding. That's, I think, is fitting, I think, in our vernacular today. But he says, he that hath the bride is the bridegroom. What's he talking about? He's talking about the church. You notice these people, John's disciples, are the ones asking this question, or these questions. Were they part of the bride? It doesn't appear so at this time anyway. Maybe eventually they would be. But those that came to Jesus for baptism, and again, we've already read where he didn't physically baptize, his disciples did. But I believe John's referring to them as the bride. You know, why would that be? Because they were the beginnings of the first church. They were the apostles, of course, being the first members, the charter members, is what we would call them. And then those that they would baptize afterwards would be members of the first church. The bride. The friend of the bridegroom which standeth and heareth him. John, when Jesus appeared on the scene, remember what he said? He said, I'm not worthy to loose the latchet on your shoes, on your sandals, much less baptize you. I have no right to do that. But Jesus insisted anyway. He said, Jesus gave him the authority to do it. He said, rejoiceth greatly because of the bridegroom's voice. When he saw Jesus that first time and realized that he was the Christ, he rejoiced. He was the one that he had been prophesying of. He said, this, my joy, therefore, is fulfilled. What I've been preaching has been fulfilled when he showed up on the scene. He's here. I'm done. You know, basically, he said, he must increase, but I must decrease. My job's done, is what John the Baptist is saying. His is starting now, and mine's over. He that cometh from above is above all. So, what does he mean, above all? He's all sovereign. He's over everything. He that is of the earth is earthly, and speaketh of the earth. He that cometh from heaven is above all. Jesus didn't come from the earth, did he? He came from heaven. The Scripture is clear on that. And what he hath seen and heard, that he testifieth. And no man receiveth his testimony. Why is that? No man is going to receive his testimony unless it's his will. He that received his testimony hath set to his seal that God is true. Only a true believer, only one of God's elect is going to receive the testimony of Christ. For he whom God hath sent speaketh the words of God. For God giveth not the Spirit by measure unto him. In other words, God didn't hold him back on anything. He preached the truth. He preached it all, the whole counsel of God, just as we're supposed to do. The Father loveth the Son, and hath given all things into his hand. Now John goes out a little further now, doesn't he? This man I'm talking about is the Son of God. He hasn't come right out and said that yet. Now it's out. This man is the son of Jesus, is the Son of God. He's the Messiah. And God has given him everything. He owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. He that believeth on the Son hath everlasting life. And he that believeth not the Son shall not see life, but the wrath of God abideth on him. So this, verse 36, goes back to verses 15 and 16. He that believeth on the Son hath everlasting life. If you believe on the Son of Jesus Christ, you're going to have everlasting life. If you don't, he that believeth not the Son shall not see life. Where are they going to be? They're going to see eternal death. Eternal death and damnation. They're going to see the wrath of God. So we're going to end with that for tonight. Just remember, sometimes, probably more times than we should, or than we do, or want to admit sometimes, we need to read things in context. It doesn't hurt, I understand if you have a favorite verse that comes to mind. Sometimes some verses are standalone verses. Sometimes a passage, you go to the book of Psalms especially, and Proverbs. Sometimes there's verses that, especially Proverbs, there's verses that are not tied to the rest of the chapter sometimes, and they're just good things to read and to learn to live by in our everyday life. But when there's context there, when something's written in context, read the context. Don't just read what you want. Read the whole thing. Get an understanding of it. It's part of studying to show ourselves approved unto God. So we're going to stop there. That's the end of this study. I don't know where we'll go next week. We'll see what the Lord has.